Alright, let's talk about one of the most elusive and mind-bending corners of the Warhammer 40k universe, the Ordo Chronos. If you've spent even a bit of time diving into the black oceans of Imperial lore, you've probably stumbled upon whispers of this strange offshoot of the Inquisition. And if you're like me, someone who's always chasing the weird, the hidden, and the dangerously obscure, you know that the Ordo Chronos isn't just some forgotten branch in an old codex. They're the kind of thing that makes even the most veteran lore hunters pause and go, wait, what is actually going on here? Because time, real, manipulable time, is supposed to be sacred, immutable, terrifying. And yet here, we have a faction within the Imperium who don't just study it. They guard vaults that may contain the keys to altering it. Just saying that out loud feels heretical. The vaults of the Ordo Chronos. Even the name has this mythic weight to it, like a forgotten vault sealed in the bedrock of reality itself. What's inside? Who has access? Is it records of possible futures? Chrono weapons? Entire timelines that have been pruned away like diseased branches? No one really knows, and that's why we're obsessed. You see, this isn't just about hidden knowledge. It's about the one force in the galaxy that even the Emperor himself couldn't fully control. Time. It cannot be reasoned with, bribed, or silenced. And if you believe what some fans have pieced together from scattered fragments across novels, codices, and those rare black library drops, it can be weaponized. So today we're going to step through the shadows. We're going to peel back the sealed doors and try to understand what the vaults of the Ordo Chronos really are, and more importantly, whether time itself has become the Imperium's most dangerous, unpredictable, and forbidden weapon. Buckle up. This one's going to get weird. If there's one thing we know about the Imperium of Man, it's that they don't create new organizations lightly, especially not within the Inquisition. Every Ordo, every sanctioned branch, every title carved into a rosette usually comes with centuries of bureaucracy, purpose, and blood. So when we talk about the birth of the Ordo Chronos, we're not just talking about a splinter group of historians or academics. We're talking about an order born out of sheer necessity, an answer to something so terrifying, so utterly beyond the control of the Imperium, that it had to be hidden behind layers of denial and silence. Most fans agree that the Ordo Chronos didn't exist during the early days of the Inquisition. You won't find mentions of them during the Horus Heresy, and even in the 10,000 years that followed, they don't start appearing in the record until relatively late, somewhere around the time warp storms began to intensify and certain anomalies started cropping up across Segmentum Solar. These weren't just strange weather patterns or psychic disturbances. We're talking full-scale chronological dislocations, entire worlds vanishing and reappearing decades later, fleets emerging from the warp having never left, time loops, histories being rewritten, and no one, not even the Ordo Malleus, had a clue what was going on. And that's the real kicker, because when the Inquisition doesn't know what to do, that's when things get dangerous. That's when they start creating new Ordos. The Ordo Chronos was formed quietly, almost off the books. No fanfare, no grand proclamation, just a shift in personnel, a few rogue inquisitors with a very specific mandate, and a sudden vacuum of information around anything involving temporal irregularities. Some say it was the High Lords who authorized their formation, terrified of what these anomalies might mean. Others whisper that the idea came from within, perhaps even from a group of inquisitors who had already experienced temporal displacement themselves and wanted to ensure no one else would. What's fascinating is how deeply isolated the Ordo Chronos became, even from their peers. Unlike the Ordo Xenos or Malleus, who interact frequently with other branches of Imperial authority, the Chronos agents became something else entirely. They didn't just investigate, they disappeared. Their missions were often one-way trips, and when they returned, if they returned, they were changed. Some came back aged decades. Others had knowledge of future events. A few didn't seem to remember who they were at all. There's this long-standing fan theory that the Ordo Chronos isn't just an order, it's a filter. a system by which the Imperium identifies individuals capable of surviving or even understanding the madness of temporal warping. Only a select few ever make it past their first mission. The rest vanish into the folds of time, or worse, become part of the very anomalies they were sent to contain. Their connection to other Ordos is tenuous at best. The Ordo Malleus considers them unreliable. The Ordo Hereticus, naturally, views them with suspicion. Some even argue that meddling with time itself is heresy. But the Ordo Chronos isn't here to make friends. Their allegiance lies with stability, temporal stability. They're not concerned with heretical texts or Xenos incursions unless those events threaten the timeline itself. There's also the growing belief among lore fans that the Ordo Chronos may not even answer to the same chain of command as the rest of the Inquisition. Think about it. If you're operating outside of time, wouldn't you need a separate structure? A form of governance that's non-linear? Some believe the Ordo has its own High Council, hidden deep in the vaults, that only exists during specific moments in history, like a rotating lock that can only be opened when the stars align, both literally and chronologically. And that brings up one of the wildest but strangely compelling ideas, that the Ordo Chronos wasn't created in the traditional sense. What if it's always existed? What if its presence is circular, a loop? Some theorize that the Ordo Chronos may have originated in the far future during the apocalyptic collapse of the Imperium and worked backward, seeding itself into the past to avert the destruction they had already witnessed. It's an insane idea, sure, but in a universe where psychic gods live in the warp and space-time is a breathing wound, it doesn't feel impossible. One fan theory even suggests that the Emperor himself foresaw the creation of the Ordo Chronos and laid the groundwork for it before the Great Crusade began. Hidden vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, forbidden texts in the Black Library of Mars, silent orders passed down through the custodies. There are so many breadcrumbs if you know where to look. Whatever their true origin, one thing is clear. The Ordo Chronos isn't like the other inquisitorial orders. They're not reactionary. They're preventative. They don't just respond to threats, they attempt to stop them before they occur, or undo them entirely. And in a universe where the line between past, present, and future is constantly eroding, that makes them one of the most terrifying tools the Imperium has ever sanctioned. Because if you can change time, even in small ways, you don't just rewrite history, you rewrite reality. Now, if the Ordo Chronos is the blade, then the vaults are the scabbard, or maybe the forge where the blade itself was tempered. There's something almost mythical about them, like ancient tombs sealed in the cracks between moments. Just saying the phrase, the vaults of the Ordo Chronos, feels like invoking something you're not supposed to acknowledge, like speaking the name of a demon or daring to stare into the eye of terror. Except, these vaults don't just threaten your soul, they might unravel your very existence across time itself. But what are they really? That's the million-throne question. Most official Imperial records, when they even hint at their existence, talk about them in the vaguest of terms: temporal containment facilities, non-linear archives, chronometric safeguard zones. It's all bureaucratic nonsense, layered in euphemism. But if you dig deeper into apocryphal sources and fan speculation, you start getting a picture that's both awe-inspiring and deeply disturbing. One of the most popular theories is that the vaults are actual physical locations, buried deep beneath the most sacred and forbidden places in the Imperium. Some say there's one under Terra itself, sealed within the bones of the pre-unification palace ruins, where the Emperor's proto-scientists once toyed with chrono-manipulation tech long before the Mechanicum formalized its doctrines. Others whisper of a vault hidden on Mars, in the Noctis Labyrinthus, buried beneath Blackstone towers and techno-heresies so ancient that even the Fabricator General won't speak their names. Then there are the stranger theories, the ones that claim the vaults aren't entirely in our reality, that they exist in temporal bubbles, locked in stasis or drifting at the edges of time like islands in a sea of causality. According to this line of thought, access to a vault isn't a matter of traveling to it, but traveling when to it. Some even believe that the vaults phase in and out of sync with real space, only becoming accessible during rare alignments of stellar events or under specific warp conditions. Imagine needing not just a map, but a calendar written in paradoxes just to find the front door. Inside, that's where things get really crazy. Depending on who you ask, the vaults could be anything from ancient chronomantic laboratories filled with devices that can rewind the life of a planet, to psychic prisons where echoes of future tyrants are sealed away before they're ever born. Some fans theorize they house failed timelines, entire strands of reality that were aborted and stored like radioactive waste. Others believe the vaults are archives, not of knowledge but of potentiality, shelves upon shelves of possible outcomes, frozen in crystal stasis, just waiting to be accessed by those insane enough to try. There's even this wild idea floating around that the vaults hold people, agents of the Ordo Chronos, who have been locked in stasis until the moment they're needed. Like contingency soldiers from a future that hasn't happened yet, waiting to be activated when the timeline begins to collapse. Some imagine these sleepers are aware, watching countless years pass in moments, aging backward or living multiple lives in parallel, constantly monitored by ancient Mechanicus constructs that barely understand what they're maintaining. What really blows my mind is the possibility that we've already seen the effects of the vaults without realizing it. Think about how often the Imperium's records contradict each other, or how entire campaigns disappear from history. It's always blamed on poor communication, warp storms, or deliberate censorship. But what if some of those inconsistencies are side effects of interventions carried out through the vaults? Not big, flashy events, but quiet nudges, shifting the birth date of a key figure by a few years, erasing a single battle so that a different hero rises to prominence. It's the butterfly effect, weaponized. And don't even get me started on the idea that some vaults might have been compromised. That's the nightmare fuel right there. If even one of these things has fallen into the wrong hands, say a radical inquisitor, a rogue tech priest, or throne forbid, a demon host, then the damage would be unimaginable. Not just a lost planet or fleet, but entire eras rewritten to serve some agenda. There's a terrifying rumor about a vault breach near the Ghoul Stars that resulted in a 300-year blackout from Imperial records. What happened during that time? Nobody knows. Nobody remembers. That's the point. Some older fans, especially those who've pored through the rarest Black Library tomes and scoured the digital ruins of old codex entries, think the vaults were never meant to be used at all. That they're fail-safes, built not to exploit time, but to contain it. That if the vaults are ever opened too far, too often, they'll tear the Imperium apart from the inside out. And honestly, I can see it. The Imperium barely holds together as is, with time behaving normally. Throw in temporal corruption, paradoxal collapses, or recursive events, and it's over. No war, no heresy, just quiet dissolution. So, are the vaults real? Personally, I think they are. Maybe not all the theories are true, but something's out there. Something the Ordo Chronos is desperate to keep hidden. And the fact that the Inquisition, in all its paranoia and self-importance, still refuses to officially acknowledge them, that just makes them feel more real. Because in the grim darkness of the far future, the most dangerous weapons aren't always guns or blades. Sometimes they're secrets sealed in vaults that shouldn't exist. Vaults that don't belong to now, then, or ever. Vaults that whisper in forgotten tongues. This is not your time. If the vaults are the storage rooms of forbidden possibility, then the tools hidden within them, what some fans call chronological weapons, are the sharpest knives in the drawer. And just like with any secret weapon in Warhammer 40K, the rumors around them are 1,000 times more insane than anything we've officially seen, which, if you know this universe, is really saying something. Let's start with the most obvious candidate: time machines. Yeah, I know. It sounds ridiculous, almost out of place in a setting obsessed with faith, superstition, and rotting machinery. But the idea that the Imperium, or at least the Ordo Chronos, might have access to actual devices capable of sending people through time isn't completely off the table. There are enough scraps in Black Library lore and obscure game supplements to suggest that time travel isn't just theoretical in the 41st millennium. It's actively dangerous and has probably already happened. Some fans point to the infamous incident involving the Necron's chronomancer tech. If the Xenos can manipulate time in combat, dodging bullets they haven't been shot with yet, rewinding wounds or anchoring themselves in causal loops, why wouldn't humanity try to reverse engineer something similar? There are stories of radical mechanicus sects experimenting with stasis fields pushed to the brink of collapse, creating time dilation zones that stretch a second into a century or compress decades into heartbeats. Weapons that could lock an entire battlefield in temporal freeze, or worse, isolate a squad of enemies in a personal loop they can never escape from. Then there's the theory of temporal acceleration. Imagine a device that doesn't move you through time, but accelerates your personal timeline. You'd see your enemies move like statues, frozen in molasses, while you dart between them like a god. Picture Space Marines enhanced not just by gene seed, but by time itself, living out years of training and experience in seconds. It sounds broken, and that's exactly the point. That kind of tech wouldn't be mass-produced. It would be reserved for the rarest of circumstances and probably comes with horrifying side effects: aging, cellular collapse, psychic fractures. But in a universe where victory means survival and failure is extermination, who wouldn't take that risk? Some speculate that the Ordo Chronos might have access to something even stranger: temporal locks. These aren't weapons in the traditional sense, but more like tools of narrative control. You seal a location or a person in a fixed point in time. Not stasis, not cryo, something far more precise. A timestamp permanently branded onto a piece of reality so it can never change. One fan compared it to save states in an old vid game. If something goes wrong, you revert. Imagine the tactical advantage. A doomed assault could be attempted again and again, each time learning from the previous failure until the perfect outcome is achieved. And yeah, that sounds dangerously close to heretical. But the Inquisition has never been afraid of that line when the stakes are high enough. Some even think that the Vault's house failed timelines that were rolled back like bad dice throws, entire wars that ended in catastrophe, only for a chrono weapon to undo the loss and try again. In this theory, every success the Imperium has had for the last 10,000 years might be built on the corpses of 1,000 erased realities. There's also this really compelling theory that time-based weaponry doesn't need to be flashy to be effective. Subtle manipulation might be even more terrifying, delaying reinforcements by an hour without anyone realizing, removing a commander from history so their influence never happens. You don't need a laser that melts planets if you can just make sure a key figure was never born. And in a galaxy where even the memory of events has power, that kind of temporal assassination is horrifying to even imagine. A few really out-there fans have proposed the idea of chrono-psychers, humans trained not to move things with their mind, but to bend time itself. It's not canon, obviously, but the warp and time are so intrinsically connected that it's not impossible to imagine someone tapping into it differently. Maybe they're not born that way. Maybe the Ordo Chronos makes them. Subjects raised in artificial temporal fields, taught to perceive causality like a fluid, and then unleashed as living weapons. Think of it. One individual, stepping through battlefields frozen mid-strike, rewriting outcomes in real time. Horrific. Godlike, probably doomed to madness. But then again, most Imperial servants are. There's also the inverse idea, what some call anti-temporal weapons. These don't mess with the timeline. They erase it. Imagine firing a shell that doesn't explode, but causes its target to never have existed in the first place. Entire units blinked out of history like they were never born. Buildings, settlements, entire cities that disappear not with fire and ruin, but with silence. Like removing a word from a sentence so the rest of the paragraph folds around it. That's the kind of power that no one should ever have, and the kind the Imperium would absolutely keep locked away, terrified that someone might use it, but even more terrified that they might need to. And then there's the classic Warhammer twist. What if none of this is actually technological? What if the vaults are filled not with machines, but with events, encased, frozen, kept on standby like bombs waiting to detonate? A failed crusade, a collapsed empire, a psychic scream that hasn't been heard yet. All of it caged in time, waiting for someone to press play. In that sense, time isn't the weapon, it's the ammunition. The terrifying thing is, we might never get real confirmation about any of this. That's kind of the point. If the Ordo Chronos is using these kinds of tools, they'd never let anyone find out. There'd be no witnesses, no survivors, just moments that feel wrong. A sense of déjà vu across an entire sector, a world that should be dead but isn't. A war that everyone remembers winning differently. So yeah, chronological weapons in Warhammer 40K, they're probably real. They're probably locked away. And if the Imperium ever decides to use them openly, I don't think the galaxy would even realize what's happened, because by the time you notice, it already didn't happen. This is where things get really disturbing. It's one thing to imagine the Imperium bending time, speeding it up, freezing it, maybe even jumping through it. But trying to break time, trying to unmake it, silence it, crush the ticking of the cosmic clock beneath a boot heel? That's something else entirely. And yet, there's this whole undercurrent of fan theories suggesting that's exactly what the Ordo Chronos, or at least some rogue faction within it, might have tried to do. Not manipulate time, not travel through it, but end it. The term anti-temporal experiments has been floating around fan circles for years. You won't find it in any official material, obviously. This is the deep lore, the basement level where canon and madness blur. The idea is that certain vaults, the most sealed and forbidden ones, don't just contain tools or weapons. They're test chambers, silent tombs where time itself has been tortured and twisted into something unrecognizable, not bent, not looped, broken. Some fans believe these experiments started as containment efforts. Imagine a world infected by a temporal parasite, some kind of warp-borne anomaly that spreads by changing causality, replicating events across different realities like a virus. To stop it, you'd need to isolate time itself. You'd need to shut it off. So, the Ordo Chronos builds a vault, locks the infection inside, and initiates what they call a temporal null state. No movement, no progression, no memory, just stillness. A place where time doesn't flow. It just sits there, bleeding quietly into nowhere. But once you build something like that, how long before someone starts experimenting with it? There's a chilling theory that somewhere in the depths of these vaults, there was an attempt to create an anti-temporal field, a space where the arrow of time didn't just stop, but reversed, shattered, or fragmented entirely. Not just for objects, but for concepts. Entire identities rewritten, histories erased. The goal, supposedly, was to create an ultimate failsafe, a reset button for reality. If the Imperium ever fell too far, if the enemy ever won too hard, they'd activate the experiment and roll the dice on a second chance. But here's the thing. You can't just erase a timeline without consequences. Fans have speculated about whole regions of space, entire sectors, that might have been cut loose from the main flow of time. Not destroyed, not forgotten, just disconnected. There are these legends of ghost systems, star charts with coordinates that no longer lead anywhere. Ships sent to investigate return hours later with centuries worth of damage. Crews speak dead languages. Children are born old. It's as if time inside those zones isn't just broken, it's vengeful. And then there are the whispers about the vaults that are sealed from the inside, places where whatever they were experimenting on became aware. Not alive in the traditional sense, but conscious. An intelligence made of paradoxes, memories that don't belong, futures that scream in reverse. Some call it the reverse sun, a theoretical anti-being formed during a failed anti-time ignition. The theory goes that it collapsed a portion of local reality and had to be caged permanently, not destroyed, because how do you kill something that exists in negative time, but held in a loop so tight it can never escape? It sounds crazy, I know, but this is Warhammer 40K. Crazy is the baseline, and there are just enough strange references in obscure lore to make you wonder. There's a passage in the Book of the Data Saints, buried in the last few pages, that talks about the stillborn Eon, a period of time that almost existed, fought violently for existence, and was then suffocated by decree of the Inquisition. What does that even mean? Was it an aborted timeline? A failed future? A living echo that had to be killed? Another recurring theme in fan discussions is the concept of time as a resource. Not energy, not data, but something that can be mined, refined, or consumed. One theory suggests that a series of vaults once functioned as time reactors, feeding chrono energy into hidden Imperial projects, maybe even the Golden Throne itself. The idea being that instead of simply holding back death, the throne is siphoning potential futures to fuel the Emperor's survival. That's horrifying, but also very on-brand for the Imperium, stealing time from the unborn to keep a corpse alive. And the darker side of all this? The experiments that didn't fail, but succeeded in ways too terrifying to replicate. There's one legend, barely a whisper among fan wikis, about something called Project Null Origin. Supposedly, it was a vault experiment aimed at erasing a single Primarch from the past, not killing him, but preventing him from ever existing. Not as punishment, but as a test, to see what would happen to the fabric of reality. The result? A chain reaction so destabilizing that 3 entire Forge worlds had to be placed in temporal quarantine, their timelines quarantined like biohazards. Now again, none of this is officially confirmed, but the pieces line up too neatly. The redacted records, the temporal voids, the sudden shifts in known history. It's like someone's trying to hold together a shattered mirror using only silence. And that's what makes these theories so compelling, even if they're terrifying. Because the question isn't whether the Imperium can stop time. It's whether they've already tried and failed. Whether these dark vaults are filled not with weapons, but wounds. Wounds inflicted on reality itself by people who thought they could control the one thing more relentless than death. The idea that the Ordo Chronos is hiding these scars, burying them under seals and silence, isn't even the scary part. The scary part is that they might one day open those vaults again, not out of ambition or curiosity, but out of desperation. Because in the grim darkness of the far future, where hope is a joke and survival is temporary, breaking time might be the last card the Imperium has left to play. And if that day comes, we won't even remember it happened. Because we never will. There's something uniquely terrifying about consequences you can't see. I mean, in the 41st millennium, tragedy is normal. Entire planets get turned into ash clouds on the regular. But when it comes to the Ordo Chronos, the disasters they might be responsible for aren't always visible. You don't get a crater or a casualty count. Instead, you get things that feel off, histories that don't line up, campaigns that never happened, but that some people swear they remember, lost heroes, whole systems that seem to have never existed at all. And that's where the horror sets in. Because if the Ordo Chronos really has been tinkering with time, then they might be behind some of the strangest, most unsettling events in the galaxy, and no one would even realize it. Take the concept of missing worlds. Every now and then you come across a planet mentioned in an old data slate or crusade log that just isn't there anymore. Not destroyed, not exterminated, just gone. No updated maps, no wreckage, nothing. Some fans have this theory that these aren't accidents, they're deliberate temporal removals. The idea is that certain planets became too dangerous, not because of Xenos or chaos, but because of what they might become. So the Ordo Chronos doesn't just wipe them out. They unmake them. They go back and tweak just enough of the past to ensure those worlds never developed in the first place. Maybe they never had the population boom that made them important. Maybe they never got discovered at all. One particularly eerie example is the so-called Void Bastion theory. It's based on fragments from a pre-Macarian era campaign against an Orc empire in Segmentum Tempestus. The Imperium supposedly launched a massive siege, supported by an elite regiment called the Bastion Guard. They won, but at catastrophic cost. Afterward, the Bastion Guard just disappeared from records. Not redeployed, not disbanded, gone. And here's the kicker. Some historians believe the Orcs were never a real threat, that the campaign destabilized the entire sector so badly that it triggered multiple warp storms. The theory? The Ordo Chronos rewound the campaign and removed the Bastion Guard from history to prevent it all from happening. But instead of fixing things, it left a scar, a sector full of gaps and contradictions like a corrupted save file. Then there are the timeline splits, events that play out differently depending on which source you're reading. The most famous case is the Gethsemane conflict. One version says it was a chaos incursion, another says it was a Necron uprising, and a third claims it never happened at all. Some people argue this is just sloppy record-keeping, which, let's be honest, is not exactly rare in the Imperium. But others think it's something more, evidence of timeline manipulation. The idea that multiple versions of reality might have existed briefly before being collapsed into one, with echoes of the others lingering like ghosts in the archives. Another fan favorite is the Chrono Crusade theory. Supposedly, there was a secret military campaign conducted under the direct guidance of the Ordo Chronos. Its purpose wasn't to destroy an enemy, but to correct a timeline that had gone off course. Entire regiments were deployed to prevent specific events from unfolding. Some were sent back centuries. Others were accelerated forward into futures that no longer exist. According to this theory, the crusade was partially successful, but the price was the erasure of everyone involved. Not through death, but through chronological disintegration. They lived, fought, and died in a reality that no longer aligns with ours. Their memories, their identities, even their descendants were never born. You can't mourn what never was, but something in the warp remembers. That leads to one of the darker interpretations of the Astronomican's fluctuations. Normally, you'd blame that kind of instability on warp storms or psychic interference. But some theorists suggest that the Astronomican, the psychic lighthouse of the Imperium, also serves as a kind of fixed point in time. When the Ordo Chronos makes significant alterations, the Astronomican stutters because the past it's anchored to no longer exists. It has to recalibrate to the new timeline, which, by the way, could explain why sometimes navigators report seeing echoes or fractured roots in the warp. Not because they're hallucinating, but because they're glimpsing the broken paths of timelines that almost happened. And of course, there's the ultimate consequence, retconning the Emperor's plan itself. There are wild rumors, mostly dismissed as heretical nonsense, but still whispered in the darker corners of lore, that the Ordo Chronos might have interfered with key events of the Horus heresy. Not to stop it, but to make sure it played out in the only survivable way. Maybe they removed worse futures. Maybe they even sabotaged the better ones, because they led to even darker outcomes in the long run. It's horrifying to think that some version of the heresy might have ended with Horus victorious, the Emperor slain, and chaos unchallenged, but that even that timeline had its own Ordo Chronos, desperately trying to reverse the reversal. And then there are the emotional consequences. Imagine being someone who remembers something no one else does. A battle you fought, a comrade you loved, a world you bled for, all gone, not destroyed, erased. You'd be labeled mad, of course. Memory corruption, trauma, warp exposure. But what if you were right? What if you were one of the few left with scars from a history that no longer fits the present? That's the kind of damage we're talking about here. Not just broken ships or lost worlds, but broken people. Paradox-burned psychers, displaced souls. Historians who chase ghosts across records that rewrite themselves overnight. The Ordo Chronos doesn't just risk the timeline, they risk the very self of the Imperium. And the worst part? We'll probably never know the full extent of their mistakes. Because if they do their job right, we don't remember the failures. The rewritten campaigns, the collapsed timelines, the civilizations that vanished like mist, all gone. No witnesses, no aftermath, just a vague sense of unease. Like something's missing. Like something important used to be here, but now it's gone. And no one even thinks to ask why. There's a reason why most Inquisitors steer clear of the Ordo Chronos. And it's not just the weird missions or the rumors of agents returning with their memories scrambled like scrambled nutrient paste. It's the knowledge, the forbidden knowledge, the kind of truths that don't just break your mind, they break your understanding of causality. And at the center of it all, acting as both guardians and jailers of that knowledge, are the archivists. Now, the term archivist in the Imperium isn't exactly rare. Plenty of administrative drones carry that title. But when it comes to the Ordo Chronos, archivist means something else. These aren't just record keepers. These are individuals who've been initiated into truths that defy linear thinking. People who don't just read history, but track how it moves, changes, loops, and sometimes vanishes entirely. They don't memorize facts. They memorize versions of facts, stacked timelines, conflicting records, entire histories that only exist in shattered fragments across sealed data caskets. And somehow they keep it all straight. Well, mostly straight. Access to this knowledge is more restricted than even Black Library level Theta. You could be a High Lord of Terra and still be denied entry to the Chrono archives. Even within the Inquisition itself, you'll find entire cabals who refuse to interact with the Ordo Chronos, not because they disapprove of its work, but because they're afraid of what they'll learn. There's this growing consensus among veteran fans that some Inquisitors have actually gone rogue after gaining limited access to Vault records, not corrupted by chaos, not turned by Xenos, just overwhelmed by the impossible truths they uncovered. You've got to remember, this is an Imperium that thrives on certainty, dogma, the illusion of order in a galaxy of madness. But the Ordo Chronos doesn't deal in absolutes. It deals in variables, in potentials. And once you start thinking in those terms, it's really hard to go back. That's why the archivists are chosen so carefully. They're not just vetted for loyalty, they're tested for perception, adaptability, resistance to paradox. Some fans even believe the archivists are partially lobotomized, not like servitors, but with psychic dampeners that allow them to store contradictory memories without breaking. One particularly compelling theory is that the archivists don't use traditional data storage at all. Instead, they encode their records in non-linear cryptography, temporal ciphers that can only be read during specific points in the galactic calendar. So, even if you steal a vault record, it's unreadable unless you know when to access it. There are whispers of devices called chrono seals, which don't lock with keys, but with time signatures, like a door that only opens every 9,113 years. And behind each of those doors, another piece of reality that maybe shouldn't have been preserved. Information about the vaults is stored in layers, each one harder to reach than the last. First, you get the myths, then the heavily redacted operational summaries, then the fractured battle reports with half the names and dates missing. But the core truths? Those are sealed in the deepest levels, accessed only by the highest-ranking archivists, and only under extreme circumstances. We're talking galaxy-ending contingencies. Not just exterminatus level, but time collapse level. And it makes sense. You don't want just anyone walking around knowing which string to pull to unravel a century. But here's the creepy part. Even they don't always understand what they're protecting. Some archivists spend their entire lives deciphering one document, one temporal knot of events that loops and frays in 1,000 impossible directions. There are tales, probably exaggerated, but who knows, of archivists who went mad after discovering that the timeline had changed under their feet. That the version of reality they'd been tracking no longer matched the one outside their vault. One fan theory says that's why so many archivists wear masks, not out of ritual, but to hide the signs of chronological degradation, premature aging, regression, phantom identities. Some say you can even hear them talking to themselves in multiple tenses. The Ordo Chronos doesn't write reports like other branches of the Inquisition. They layer them, multi-threaded documents, past, present, and possible future written side by side. It's less like reading a file and more like trying to tune into a dozen voices all speaking different versions of the same event. And if you're not trained, that kind of information will break you. Which is why even the most powerful inquisitors often choose to remain willfully ignorant. Better to not know what was almost undone. What really unsettles me, though, is the idea that not even the archivists know how much is missing. That the vaults themselves might be decaying, not physically, but temporally. Records slipping into entropy, sealed truths becoming unstuck from reality. There's a particularly grim hypothesis going around that some vaults have become infected, not by warp entities, but by corrupted timelines, self-editing documents, causal loops that rewrite their own storage protocols, archivists who remember their own deaths or whose personal logs begin before they were born. It gets to the point where you start asking if the vaults are protecting us from time, or if time is being protected from us. Because once you let those ideas loose, they don't just stay on paper. They change how you see everything. Suddenly, every inconsistency in Imperial history feels like a clue. Every missing detail becomes a warning, and the archivists are the only ones left who can tell the difference between a mystery and a mistake. But don't expect them to share. They guard these truths not just with silence, but with fear. And not fear for themselves, but fear of us. Because if even one of these secrets ever made it into the wrong hands, it wouldn't just shatter worlds. It could unwrite them. Strip them from the timeline like they never mattered. Like they never even happened. And that's the weight these archivists carry. Not power, not glory, but a quiet, soul-crushing burden. Watching history rot, rewriting it with shaking hands, praying that no one ever asks the questions that would force them to answer. When you start thinking about how the Ordo Chronos fits into the grand machinery of the Imperium, you realize pretty quickly that they're like a missing gear, essential but hidden deep in the mechanism, spinning in ways that don't seem to connect to anything else, and yet somehow keep the whole mess from flying apart. Unlike more visible branches of the Inquisition, they don't parade around with squads of stormtroopers or walk into ecclesiarchy chambers barking orders. No, the Ordo Chronos operates in whispers, back channels, and cryptic requests. But make no mistake, they are plugged in, just not in the ways we'd expect. Let's start with the Adeptus Mechanicus, because this relationship is as complicated as it is crucial. You'd think the tech priests would be all over the Ordo Chronos, right? After all, who else in the Imperium is more obsessed with knowledge, especially forbidden or esoteric tech? But it's not that simple. The Mechanicus is obsessed with stable knowledge, patterns, repeatability, sacred blueprints etched into logic engines. Temporal mechanics? That's chaos incarnate. Time loops don't follow the STC format. They corrupt data. They produce non-repeatable phenomena. It drives the Mechanicus insane. Still, there are rumors, persistent ones, that certain Forge worlds, especially the more radical ones like Styges the Eight, have maintained secret pacts with Chronos agents. These aren't casual alliances. We're talking about full-blown codependencies. Chronos gets access to prototype chronomantic devices, sometimes scavenged from Xenos ruins, other times engineered in defiance of every known law of physics. And in return, the Mechanicus gets to observe what happens when they're used. Not in simulations, but in the field. There's even a theory that some of the most dangerous vaults are actually hosted beneath Mechanicus enclaves, where they're monitored by a blend of tech priests and time-warped servitors. And then there's the Navigators. Now this is where things get really interesting. Navigators don't experience space-time like the rest of us. Their warp perception is already detached from linear reality. So if anyone could sense temporal disruption, it would be them. That's probably why some fans believe the Ordo Chronos relies heavily on Navigator bloodlines, not just for warp travel, but for identifying rifts in time. There's a creepy little theory that certain Navigator houses, maintain secret cadet branches trained specifically to serve the Ordo Chronos. These aren't your typical warp pilots. They're seers of alternate futures, dreamers of what could have beens, trained to feel the flow of time itself bending the wrong way. The Astronomicon might also play a bigger role than we give it credit for. Traditionally, it's the psychic lighthouse that lets ships navigate the warp, but some fans suggest it might also be a kind of temporal anchor, a fixed point in human consciousness around which time coheres. If that's true, then any significant temporal manipulation might cause detectable ripples in the Astronomicon's pulse. Maybe the Ordo Chronos doesn't just monitor the timeline by watching events. Maybe they listen to how the Astronomicon stutters or shifts in pitch. It's speculative, yeah, but there are reports, buried deep in lore texts, that link sudden fluctuations in the Astronomicon's clarity to mysterious Chronos deployments across the Segmentum Solar. Now, when we get to the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, things go from intriguing to outright terrifying. Because if time can be weaponized, and if psychic phenomena already bend the rules of cause and effect, then psychers, especially sanctioned ones, might be the perfect test subjects. There's a fan theory that the Ordo Chronos has its own psyker program, completely off the books, where they train individuals not to throw lightning bolts or detect heresy, but to experience multiple timelines. The idea is that these temporal psychers are less like warriors and more like living instruments, calibrated to detect paradox, to feel the scars of altered events in the warp itself. Some fans go even further, claiming that the Ordo Chronos actively works with the black ships, selecting specific psychers during collection runs for unknown purposes. These psychers never arrive at Terra. Their destinies are rerouted, rewritten. Maybe they're locked in vaults, forced to dream across centuries. Maybe they're used to patch broken realities, psychically stitching timelines back together after risky experiments go sideways. It's all speculative, but the pattern of missing psychers, especially those with unusual cognitive abilities, is too consistent to ignore. And then there's the elephant in the room, the other inquisitorial Ordos. To say that the Ordo Hereticus and the Ordo Chronos have a strained relationship would be putting it mildly. Hereticus thrives on absolutes. They see corruption, they burn it. End of story. The Chronos, they swim in ambiguity, in paradox, in potentiality. That kind of thinking is deeply unsettling to Puritans. There are whispered cases of Hereticus agents denouncing Chronos cells as rogue radicals, and while most of those accusations vanish behind sealed files, it's not hard to imagine that some of them ended in inquisitorial duels or quiet purges. The Ordo Malleus is a bit more tolerant, mostly because they've seen what happens when causality unravels thanks to the warp. If anyone understands how time can bleed, it's the demon hunters. In fact, there's speculation that the Malleus and Chronos occasionally collaborate on closed-loop containment operations. These are events where demonic incursions have caused time itself to fracture, places where battles have to be fought more than once, where soldiers remember dying and yet walk again. And who else could clean up after something like that but the Ordo Chronos? It all paints a picture of an organization that doesn't operate in isolation, but in the shadows of everything else. They lean on the Mechanicus for tech they can barely understand. They rely on Navigator insight to feel where the timeline is wrong. They use psychers not as weapons, but as sensors, guides, and maybe even sacrifices. And they move carefully through the complex web of inter-ordo politics, never fully trusted, but never quite expendable either. That's what makes the Ordo Chronos so compelling. They're everywhere and nowhere, connected to every critical system in the Imperium, yet somehow always just out of reach. You can't run an empire without time. And if someone is secretly guarding the clock, adjusting the hands, replacing the gears, making sure it never stops or spins out of control, you better believe they're talking to everyone, even if no one knows it. There's something strangely addictive about chasing the scent of a cover-up in Imperial history, especially when it feels like time itself is in on the conspiracy. The Imperium has always been a labyrinth of conflicting records, contradictory victories, and heroes that appear from nowhere. But once you start looking at those inconsistencies through the lens of the Ordo Chronos, the puzzle pieces click together in ways that are way too neat to ignore. Because there are stories, half-whispers, fractured testimonies, redacted documents that suggest someone, somewhere, is nudging the timeline, smoothing out the wrinkles, or maybe folding it in on itself. Let's talk about one of the most infamous of these cases, the Battle of Solstice Reach. Official records claim it was a minor skirmish in the Ultima Segmentum, little more than a containment action against a splinter Tyranid fleet. But here's the thing. There are 3 separate records of the battle, all describing different commanding officers, different strategies, and wildly different outcomes. In one version, the defenders were wiped out, the planet consumed. In another, a last-minute arrival by the Adeptus Astartes turned the tide. And in the third, the battle never happened at all. It's just a footnote in an outdated chart. Now, that could be dismissed as clerical error or warp corruption. But fans who've dug deeper found something strange. All versions were uploaded to Imperial data archives within minutes of each other, marked with different temporal codes. It's like someone tried to overwrite the event while it was still being recorded. If that's not evidence of Chronos interference, I don't know what is. Then there's the legend of Inquisitor Varnus, the so-called man who wasn't. He appears in several references across scattered campaign logs, always just briefly, always at critical moments. He rallies troops in the defense of Lugus Prime, negotiates an emergency truce with Eldar forces on Elian's spine, and is even mentioned in passing during a report on High Fleet Ouroboros. But here's the kicker. He doesn't exist in any central inquisitorial registry, not even as a rogue. No birth records, no Rosette serials, no official mission logs. It's like he's a ghost imprinted on reality. The prevailing fan theory? Varnus was a Chronos agent, inserted retroactively into key events to shift outcomes, then erased once his purpose was fulfilled. A temporal placeholder, designed to make sure things happen just right. And then we have the 9-day War of Larthax. Except, depending on who you ask, it lasted 47 days, or never started at all. Veterans from that region of space tell stories of a brutal campaign against heretics and demonic constructs, but the official records have been scrubbed almost completely clean. What's left is barely a skeleton of an event. Some transcripts have been recovered, though, and they speak of time anomalies during the campaign. Soldiers aging rapidly in minutes, Vox records echoing messages that hadn't been sent yet, orbital logs duplicating the same fleet movements multiple times. According to one fragment, a Mechanicus Magos was heard muttering the phrase, "Chronoloop collapse imminent," moments before vanishing into thin air. If that wasn't an Ordo Chronos containment operation, then it was exactly the kind of thing they'd want to clean up. Another curious anomaly is the shifting fate of the Shieldhold Bastion on Marnak 6. For decades, it was listed as a fortified shrine world under siege. Then, without warning, it reappeared in records as a thriving forge colony, with no mention of the war that had supposedly consumed it. The defenders? Gone. Their descendants? Reassigned to entirely different planetary designations. One fan theory suggests that the original timeline saw Marnak 6 fall to chaos, becoming a festering demon world. The Ordo Chronos, desperate to prevent this, activated a contingency buried deep in one of the vaults and reset a portion of the local timeline. But like a bad memory, fragments of the original future leaked through. That's why so many pilgrims on Marnak 6 still report vivid dreams of fire and screaming skies, memories from a life that never happened. And let's not forget the silent conquest of Darcine, a war no one fought, but everyone seems to remember. No official declaration, no deployment. But relics found on the surface show signs of extensive Astartes activity, bolter casings, land raider tracks, even purity seals bearing the mark of the Iron Hands. Yet no chapter claims responsibility. Some say the conquest was a trial run for Chronos field manipulation, a battle played out, assessed, and then unwound. Reset because the cost was too high, or because it triggered an unacceptable future outcome. Whatever the reason, the echoes remain. And the planet's population? They just call it The year the sky bled twice. They don't know what it means. They just feel it. There's something incredibly eerie about these stories. Not just because of the timelines they suggest, but because of what they imply. That history isn't fixed. That the victories we celebrate, the heroes we venerate, the tragedies we mourn, any one of them might have played out differently, and we'd never know, unless something goes wrong, unless there's a glitch, a survivor, a record that didn't get scrubbed properly. And maybe that's what really keeps the Ordo Chronos up at night. Not the act of changing time, but the risk of being caught, of someone finding the seam in the fabric, tugging at it, and seeing what unravels. Because if these stories are true, if even one of them is, then the Ordo Chronos isn't just managing history. They're writing it, editing it, deleting it. And the rest of us, we're just trying to make sense of the rough draft. There's a term that pops up occasionally in the dustiest corners of Imperial history, too rarely to be official, too persistent to be coincidence. The lost years. Or, if you want to get truly ominous, the empty centuries. To most citizens of the Imperium, the concept is meaningless. Just another gap in the great half-burned library of human history. But for those of us who live and breathe the darker edges of lore, the ones who dig through forbidden texts and cross-reference conflicting timelines, the term sends a chill down the spine. Because if these lost periods are real, and there's mounting evidence that they are, then someone has been editing time itself. Not just records, not just memory, actual history. The first time I came across it was in a footnote of a Xeno-history codex, of all things. A casual mention that a particular crusade had taken place during the second span of the empty years. No explanation, no context. Just this quiet implication that there were blocks of time that no longer fit within the timeline. That was the crack in the wall. Since then, I've seen hints scattered across obscure sources. Mission logs with unexplained dating inconsistencies, archived sermons referring to past centuries that no longer appear in official chronologies, even legends among isolated hive populations that speak of the sleep of empires, or the years the stars stood still. The idea, for those not familiar, is that there are gaps in the Imperium's timeline, periods of 50, 100, sometimes even 300 years, that simply aren't accounted for. They're not marked by war or upheaval or even warp storms. They're absences, time that passed and then didn't. Like blank pages in the middle of a book you thought you were reading. Some claim it's just the result of poor record keeping, especially during events like the Age of Apostasy or the Nova Terra Interregnum. But others believe something more insidious happened, that these years were deliberately erased, wiped clean by the Ordo Chronos to remove events too catastrophic, too disruptive, or too paradoxical to be allowed to remain. One of the more popular theories is that the empty years are a side effect of failed temporal experiments, that the Ordo Chronos, in attempting to alter certain key events, accidentally collapsed whole stretches of linear time, causing reality to snap back into a safer configuration, one where the dangerous anomaly never occurred. But just because it never happened doesn't mean no one remembers it. And that's where things get deeply unsettling. There are scattered reports, most of them classified, some of them only accessible through fringe cult networks, of individuals who claim to remember events that no longer exist. Veterans who recall fighting in campaigns that never happened. Administratum scribes who insist their ledgers once included planets that no longer appear on any star charts. Even psychers whose visions seem to be haunted by ghosts from unmade centuries. The term some use is chrono-echoes. Memories from realities that have been overwritten, like lingering after-images of a dream you weren't supposed to wake up from. One of the most compelling bits of evidence comes from the Librarius Tacticae compiled on Hydrafer. A scholar there, long dead now, compiled over 200 references to a planet called Ferran Ultima, supposedly a vital agri-world in the late 38th millennium. The thing is, Ferran Ultima doesn't exist. It appears nowhere in official records, has no stellar coordinates, and isn't even listed as a dead world. but there are dozens of primary sources mentioning it: transit logs, tithing schedules, even missionary bulletins, all pointing to a world that somehow slipped out of history. The leading fan theory: the Ordo Chronos erased the planet from time during one of the empty years, not because it was corrupted or lost, but because something worse happened, something that risked unspooling the entire sector's future. And then there's the strange case of the Astartes chapter known only as the Ash Sentinels. No official founding, no known gene seed, but there are field reports from over 9 worlds, spanning 5 different sectors, that reference them as active participants in campaigns between the years 3903 and 3920. Then, nothing, not even a record of their disappearance. They're just gone, as if they never existed. Some fans believe the Ash Sentinels were a temporal creation, an emergency countermeasure pulled from another timeline by the Ordo Chronos to combat a threat that's since been erased. Once the job was done, their reality collapsed, and they were folded back into the vault of untime. Even the ecclesiarchy seems to have encountered these anomalies, though they interpret them through their own lens. Some fringe sects preach about the years of silence, when the Emperor turned his gaze away and allowed mankind to be tested. Others say that these gaps are divine punishments, moments when humanity was removed from the Book of Fate and had to claw its way back in. It's poetic and terrifyingly close to what the Chronos loyalists might describe as a timeline censure. What really haunts me, though, is the thought that maybe the Ordo Chronos didn't cause the empty years. Maybe they're just cleaning up the mess. Maybe something older, deeper, more broken is responsible. A warp phenomenon. A Necron chrono weapon that scarred time itself. Or even the Emperor, back before the throne, experimenting with time and causality during the dark age of technology. Whatever it is, the vaults may not be laboratories. They might be containment cells, holding the wreckage of entire timelines that were too unstable to coexist with ours. At the end of the day, the empty years aren't just historical gaps. They're wounds. And some of us, the ones who dig too deep, can feel them, like a buzzing at the base of the skull, a quiet hum that tells you something is missing, not forgotten, removed. You look at the stars and they seem out of place. You remember a name and no one else does. You wake from a dream where everything made sense, and you're left wondering if the life you're living now is the real one, or just the one that was chosen to survive. And that's the real fear behind the empty years. Not just that time was changed, but that you weren't supposed to notice. After going through everything, the vaults, the archivists, the fractured timelines, the erased crusades, and the chilling silence of the empty years, it's hard not to sit back and ask the big question: can time really be used as a weapon in the Imperium? Not just studied or feared or worshipped, but wielded, directed, turned into a blade that cuts not flesh or steel, but causality itself. It's the kind of question that makes your brain itch just thinking about it. But honestly, I think the answer might be yes. Not just hypothetically, not just in wild fan theories, but actively, quietly, horrifyingly. Yes, but it's not a weapon in the way a laser gun or bolter is a weapon. It's not something you aim and pull a trigger on. Time as a weapon is insidious. It's scalpel, poison, and plague. It doesn't destroy armies with explosions. It makes sure those armies were never born. It doesn't win battles. It erases them from ever being fought. It's the war you don't remember losing because the timeline where you lost doesn't exist anymore. And the idea that something or someone has that kind of control is both fascinating and absolutely terrifying. When you really look at the Ordo Chronos, it's like seeing the tip of a blade poking out of the shadows. You know there's more, deeper in the dark. You know someone's holding the hilt, but you can't see who or how deep the weapon goes. Every vault, every theory about rewound campaigns and vanished regiments and retroactive assassinations, it all points to one thing. This isn't just about preserving history, it's about rewriting it, Not recklessly, not constantly, but strategically. In moments of desperation. In the face of outcomes so dire that the only way forward was to go backward. And that's where I think the real danger lies. Because even if the Ordo Chronos began with noble intentions, if they were created to safeguard reality from collapse, it's almost impossible to imagine that power like this hasn't been abused. Even once. Even accidentally. Maybe they changed something small to save a sector. Maybe they removed a heretic's influence before he was ever born. Maybe they rewound a failed crusade just enough to avoid total disaster. But once you've done that, once you've seen the timeline shift and work, how do you stop? How do you not keep tweaking? That's what scares a lot of fans, and it scares me too. The idea that time, in the hands of the Imperium, could become the most authoritarian tool of all. Not just deciding who lives or dies, but what events are even allowed to have happened. It goes beyond censorship. It's beyond even exterminatus. It's the final evolution of control. The power to choose which version of the Imperium gets to be real. There's a running fan theory, and I admit I've come to believe it, that the Ordo Chronos has a list, a living archive of timelines, a spectrum of pasts and futures constantly shifting in and out of favor. And somewhere deep in those vaults, there's someone or something watching it all, choosing, not like a god, not omniscient or all-knowing, just desperate, strategic, calculating which version of history keeps the Imperium afloat for one more millennium. It's less about domination, more about survival. But in that survival is embedded compromise, sacrifice, and the quiet death of truth. I think that's why so many Inquisitors fear the Ordo Chronos, not because of what they do, but because of what they might unmake. You can fight heresy. You can root out demons. You can even hold the line against Xenos. But you can't fight what never existed. You can't accuse a timeline of being false when you no longer remember the true one. If time is a battlefield, then the Ordo Chronos doesn't fight on it. They edit it. And that makes them scarier than any bolter-wielding Puritan or warp-obsessed radical. And yet, part of me, maybe the darkest part, wants to believe they're doing the right thing. That somewhere in those nightmare vaults, there are records of horrors we never had to live through because someone took the risk to change the flow. That some of the victories we celebrate, some of the golden moments in this otherwise hopeless universe, only happened because time was bent into allowing them. That someone cared enough to rewrite history, not for power, but for a chance at a better outcome, even if it came at a terrible cost. Because the truth is, time in Warhammer 40K isn't a straight line. It's a storm, a bleeding wound, and maybe the Ordo Chronos isn't trying to weaponize it in the traditional sense. Maybe they're just trying to survive it, or shape it, or at the very least, stop it from tearing the Imperium into paradoxical shreds. If that means meddling, hiding truths, or burning entire centuries from memory, well, it wouldn't be the first time the Imperium chose survival over purity. So yes, time can be a weapon, and in the hands of the Ordo Chronos, it already is. The real question is whether that weapon is pointed at our enemies, or at the very foundations of what we think we know. Because when you mess with time, the first casualty is never a person. It's certainty. And in a universe like this, that might be the most dangerous thing of all. The Ordo Chronos is one of those mysteries in Warhammer 40K that sticks with you. Not because of flashy battles or famous heroes, but because they force you to question the very structure of the universe. Every other faction in the Imperium is fighting to control space, planets, systems, sectors. The Ordo Chronos? They're fighting to control time, and not in a metaphysical, philosophical way, but in the most literal, terrifying sense possible. They don't just respond to threats. They rearrange the order in which those threats happen, or make sure they never do. What makes them so endlessly fascinating isn't just the secrecy or the mind-bending implications of their work. It's that we'll never know the full story. And that's kind of the point. The vaults they guard aren't just filled with data or artifacts. They're filled with possibility, with aborted futures, failed pasts, and moments that no longer fit the narrative. And they're not just protecting the Imperium from those things. They're protecting the timeline from us, from knowledge that would make even the strongest psyker lose their grip on reality. There's something deeply human about that, in a way. That even in this brutal, unfeeling galaxy, there are people trying to preserve some kind of continuity, however twisted, however compromised. And maybe that's why this subject hits so hard with fans. We're all drawn to the idea of what if? What if the Horus heresy had gone differently? What if Sanguinius had lived? What if Cadia still stood? The Ordo Chronos exists in that very space, not just asking those questions, but doing something about them. They're the answer to the what-ifs we're too scared to answer. It's easy to paint them as villains, and maybe in some stories they are. Meddling with time is never clean. Someone always loses something, even if it's just the memory of who they were. But if you believe, even for a second, that the Imperium has survived this long purely by chance or brute strength, then you're missing the deeper picture. Maybe the Ordo Chronos is the hidden hand that's been pulling the strings all along, failing, learning, erasing, and trying again. A timeline on loop until the version we're living in finally works, or at least works well enough. And that's why they're unique. Because they don't fit into the usual mold of 40K storytelling. They're not marching in parades or storming fortresses. They're not hunting demons with flaming swords or preaching the Emperor's word with bolter fire. They're slipping between moments, smoothing out the wrinkles, deleting the mistakes, and sometimes, even more frighteningly, introducing them on purpose. Because sometimes a wound now prevents the infection later. That's their logic. Cold, detached, necessary. As fans, we cling to these scraps of knowledge because they let us feel like we've glimpsed something bigger than any one battle or war. Like we've found the edges of the map and caught a glimpse of what lies beyond. And sure, maybe half of what we discuss is speculation. Maybe 90% of it is. But that's the fun. That's what makes the Ordo Chronos such a perfect storm of lore, mystery, and fan obsession. They're the ultimate riddle in a setting built entirely on contradictions. And every time we think we're getting closer to the truth, it slips away, like a memory that never belonged to us in the first place. So if you've made it this far, if you're still with me after all the theories, conspiracies, and paradoxes, then clearly you're as lost in this rabbit hole as I am. And I love that. I want to hear your theories. What do you think is locked inside the vaults? Do you think the Ordo Chronos is really rewriting history, or are they just barely holding it together? If you enjoyed this dive into the weirdest corners of the Imperium, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with your take on the Ordo Chronos. I'm genuinely curious what you all think. Should time be a weapon? Is it already won? And most importantly, do we remember the timeline correctly, or are we just living in the most convenient version of a very long and very broken story? Until next time, stay vigilant. And if someone ever tells you they remember something that never happened, maybe, just maybe, believe them.